I'm going to go to a more micro scale and share a few current stories with you. I thought what I'd do today is just look at current adventures I'm having, share them with you, because you need to pause when you're on an adventure and reassess what you're doing. The title of my talk was really to address quite seriously the idea of live, design, transform life. I said, soar like an eagle and embrace change. Since 2007, when I left academia, I started practicing what I preached, and it's become this amazing adventure where whatever one dreams seems to come to reality. So you've got to be careful what you dream. I'm basically putting forward an activist stand, as we've had today from Heinrich and various other people, because I think as a profession, if you're swimming against the tide or not, you've got to actually fight for what's worthwhile. This is not my building either, but why I'm showing this building as an opening shot is I've had the privilege to work with wonderful people. One of them is Joe Ritchie. He's a billionaire who made his money through options trading. I'm working in Malawi with the urban poor, with responsible tourism, with trying to actually work with the informal sector. He doesn't do it for money, he does it as a patron. But he recently phoned me up and said, Peter, I've got a problem. I've always looked after my own financial affairs, and I've always tended to. He happens to be this man who owns one of the foremost arts and crafts houses in America, the last house designed by Charles Green on a cliff face at Carmel, which my wife and I have just had the pleasure of being there for 2 weeks, which I'll share with you. So he's got good taste, but he's also extremely intelligent, and he's an American who was brought up as a kid in Afghanistan. He's a radical person, he's a questioning person, and he can sort of see the future. And he's tended to always have his operation looking after his own financial affairs in an industrial building on the periphery of Chicago, where he's taken the furniture that's significant of home to him. And he said, I've got to move into a corporate building on the 4th floor of this building, because investors want to invest with me. And the sort of investors that want to invest with me, they come in their jeans and open neck shirts. They're not banker wankers. They go to Morgan Stanley downstairs, and they're people who have real money. And I hate the corporate world. That was his brief to me. This is Joe Ritchie. I think I've skipped a slide. And he took me he phoned me up and said, you know, I'm dealing with, firstly he qualified. He said in developing economies like America, and I've certainly found recently in Australia, where your money is so valuable, you can't afford, just because of your labor cost. I mean, here it's $150 minimum wage for labor. You can't afford to make the handmade. So you get forced into this Gucci society where everything is slick. Okay, and you've got no access to anything. I mean, Glenn Murcutt talks about Australian children suffering from a nature disorder. They don't even know the tides or the rhythm of the sun or anything. They've got to almost counsel them. And it comes from being in the slick world. And he said to me, I absolutely hate everything about the corporate world. I hate the suspended ceiling. I hate the air conditioning ducts, the floor, the blinds, the vertical blinds. I just can't see myself living in that environment. I'm finding an African to think out of the box. This is Joe. He's an advisor to a number of President Kagame and the president of Malawi. And he does it out of the goodness of his heart, because he's made his money. He wants to do something worthwhile, and he surrounds himself with what he calls live ones. At one stage, he did buy the site of the Hollywood sign and found it actually had business rights, and caused a huge upstir, and had to sell it back to the council. But his brief to me was, I want my office, and this is a challenge, I'm talking to interior designers, because very often, he just said, I don't want designer arrogance. I don't want designers to come and put office furniture in front of me, which is awful, which they think it is inevitable that I have to receive it. And he says, I want my business to be like a startup business in a garage. Now, my knowledge of startup business in a garage is this sort of thing, which we get in the veld of South Africa. So suddenly I conjured up pictures of Baghdad Cafe. Okay? And then he said, also wanted to be like the Dirty Dozen. Now, I didn't quite understand what he meant by the Dirty Dozen. Then I watched the movie, and it hasn't got to do with guns. It's got to do with a boer maak 'n plan. That's actually what it's got to do with, just making a plan. And this is the entrance to his new headquarters. And he said, I want an architecture that you can smell, you can touch, and you can taste. And he says, we don't get it in our society because we over-engineer everything. If I've got to actually make a rusty wall, I don't want Core 10. I want it left out in the rain so it actually requires a patina and a pattern that's on its own. So he's a wonderful client to have a dialogue with. And then everything has a story. He drives a Saab. Why? Because he flies an Avanti aircraft, which I'll show you, which is that fastest jet in the world with the fins in front. He flies it himself. And he said, I drove an Audi, but then I went and I did some research, and someone said, do you know aeronautical engineers developed the Saab? 2 of them had never driven before, but they worked it from first principles, and it's where the seatbelt came from. So he now drives a Saab, and he says, you know, there's a delight that I get from it. Now, how can you create an environment we have a delight in? And the same applies to the aeroplane. So he's got good taste. Then he owns one of the best arts and craft houses in America, where we stayed recently. These are sketches of mine. How's that for a buttress? It's actually purely aesthetic. He's got Noguchi's stonemason did a stone which he put on top of the hill to mark the crescent. And when you go into this house, he says, when I go on holiday, I want my home to be like an old boot. It's like that favorite pair of shoes that you actually wear. There's sort of R.M. Williams that you've spent 27 years breaking. I don't want some guy to take me downtown to get the latest. And I'm not that I'm conservative. These are just sketches that I did of this world. And then he finds the right people to actually, just at the top of the Big Sur, make these beautiful spaces. He finds Jed, who's an ex-South African who lives in Tasmania, and he finds bits of driftwood coming down. And he said, I actually want imperfection in the boardroom table that I go. I don't want that designer thing that's going to go to the Milan Triennale. I told the organizer of the World Design Capital, Elaine, earlier that I was going to talk about designer arrogance. I don't think she's here. I think she ran away. I didn't mean to scare her. These are drawings. This is the drawing you have when you do your teeth. And then while we went there, Joe said, take the place and go and see the way we live. And by the way, there's this 1941 Packard Woody that you can drive. I had to have a photograph taken. Those are pellet guns, by the way, which I got from the owner, because we were actually doing this caricature. But when we started talking about his office, we said, well, what sort of office do you want, Joe? They're different cultures. You know, Bureau Happold in London have this culture, have that culture. He said, you know what I want? I want the one idea that you've got there, which is, I don't know if I can activate this. It's the idea of having a series of courtyards and a street. It's really the African village. That's all it is. Because he says, I don't want boardrooms. I want people to have, because good ideas are made when you're hanging out around a casita type situation. So how can we neutralize all of that? So we started to form 2 ideas. One was edicules of space. The other one was the idea of ripping out the ceiling and putting vaults through the top of the ceiling. We started to do some drawings. And I started to articulate that if you make edicules of space, which are just cupboards that define 4 corners, but they open at the corners, and you go and look at Oak Park and you have a look at what Frank Lloyd Wright in his studio did, and you make the corners fly, you can suddenly make these internal worlds where you put the Afghan carpet, where you have that lamp that gives you that ambient light. It gives you an extra glow, and it's also where you take the artifacts that have been lying around that no one's noticed, and you suddenly make them special because they've got a place to be. And we started articulating what that could be as a world. I then went to his Fox River farm, and we said, why don't we make the vaults out of the mud of your farm? These are sketches of mine. And a tree was fallen down by a beaver, and then I found a tree that was struck by lightning. Why don't we cut that tree up in 9-foot lengths, get a wonderful man from the Mississippi to come and put it together again with bolts, and we have a legacy of that tree in your space. This is it being made, and this is how it's put together. It's no longer a tree, it's an artwork. And then everything has a story, and he loves the story of how you you've got this thing where you've got to actually $150 an hour. You can't actually employ local labor. So you go out to his farm and you find the son of his neighbor on the farm says, oh, I'll make molds for concrete pots. I'll do this. So he loves enabling other people's lives, whether it's women's groups doing banking in Malawi or whatever. So there's a process to this. And then this becomes the entrance. The idea that you don't just open a door, ching ching, and you're inside and outside. You actually have this acoustic experience which bursts into the space, which is made out of tiles made out of the mud of his river. And then you move into the space, and then you move down.